Governor Snyder suspends efforts to accept Syrian refugees, more fallout from the Flint water debacle, and the rebirth of Stephen Henderson's childhood home in Detroit. MiWeek starts right now.
Recently, Michigan's economy has begun to turn around. Michigan's gained over 250,000 new jobs. We've paid off $20 billion in long-term debt. And our population is increasing for the first time in a decade. But to make Michigan a top 10 state, there's still plenty of work to be done. Step up and help put Michigan on top. Learn what you can do at MichiganTurnaroundPlan.com.
Funding is also provided by Delta.
Hi there and welcome to MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Christy McDonald. What a week. The world is still reeling from the terrorist attacks in Paris and all the questions and the safety and fighting ISIS that go along with it. But a bigger debate has started over Syrian refugees and how many should be allowed into the U.S., including here in Michigan. Coming up tonight, we'll discuss Governor Snyder's decision to stop encouraging Syrian refugees to come into Michigan and why other governors are taking an even harder line. And we'll talk about how the Paris attacks are impacting security in the United States. Also coming up tonight, Flint is hooked up to the Detroit water system, but that doesn't mean the health crisis is over. It is just beginning. We will take a look at the fallout from Flint to Washington, D.C. And Stephen Henderson takes a project on near and dear to him. We'll talk about his efforts to revive a Detroit neighborhood where he grew up. But we start tonight with a story that has topped this week's headlines. The deadly terrorist attacks in Paris has the United States on high alert. Here in Michigan, Governor Snyder has suspended efforts to relocate Syrian refugees to the state. He says Homeland Security should review its vetting process to make sure that terrorists don't slip into the U.S. Over 20 other governors have also gone on record opposing the entry of refugees into their states. And that's where we start tonight with our contributors Nolan Finley from the Detroit News, Stephen Henderson from the Detroit Free Press. Guys, it's good to see you, and amazing how the conversation in the world changes in just a week. From last Thursday, this wasn't even on our radar screen, to everything that then happened until now. And now we're hearing of potential ISIS is obviously threatening Washington and New York right now. Nolan.
Yeah, and you mentioned the governor and the refugees, and we supported the governor when he said we want to bring 10,000 or more refugees right to Michigan to help us repopulate our cities and bring in much-needed skills and workers to the state. But I think he took the only path he could this week. It was a prudent decision. He was very careful over and over to say this is not a permanent stop. He's committed still to resettling refugees here, but you had to reassure the people, and I think that's good for both the refugees and the people of Michigan to hear more about the vetting process to make sure everybody's comfortable when those folks rely here. It's actually what the president should have done on Tuesday when he spoke about this. Instead, he threw a temper tantrum. That didn't do any good for the cause. I mean, these are legitimate concerns people have. They're looking at Paris and they're frightened. There's good answers to the questions. These people are carefully vetted. There's no reason to shut this program down, but the people do need a little reassurance, and they need to know how the vetting process works.
All right, before we take a deeper dive into the vetting process, let me ask you about the governor's decision to step out and say, you know what, we're going to not push our efforts in having more Syrian refugees here.
Well, I mean, it was a play to the sort of jingoism and bigotry that lies at the far extremes of this conversation. Because the truth is, he has no control over how many Syrian refugees come to the United States or come to Michigan. The fact is that states' borders are open. I mean, if they come to Ohio or if they come to Kentucky or Indiana, they can get to Michigan just as easily as they can get anywhere else. He has no real power to stop that from happening. I think if he had framed it differently and said, listen, we still want to do this. We want Homeland Security to be more vigilant than they maybe were prepared to be, to make sure that they don't come here as terrorists, don't let terrorists in, and stopped there, it would have been fine. But there was a real play to hard right politics on his PAC page, on all these places where this pushback against this idea of Syrian refugees coming here and causing trouble is bubbling up. So it was a little disappointing.
You look at his Peace and Time, there was none of that. In fact, over and over, he said, we need these people here. We want these people here. We want to resume the program. But he said exactly what you said he should say. We want to hear from Homeland Security. We want to hear from the State Department. I don't know anything about that. I didn't see
the
it.
part that I'm pushing back against is the idea that he should somehow slow this. He has no control over that.
He has no control over that, but the states do receive federal funding to help out with refugees who are then centered in their states. And other governors have taken a harder stance on this, Nolan, saying that maybe they would turn that funding down and wouldn't want refugees in their state. And the governor did not say that. He was much more nuanced in what his opinion was.
I mean, he wasn't even nuanced. He flat out says we're waiting for some reassurance from Homeland Security and the State Department, but we want to continue this program. And he made a very powerful statement about the benefits of the refugees. This is what I say that had the president done what Snyder did and try to reassure people and say, look, we're putting in steps, we're putting in processes. All he had to say is, we've been letting refugees in this country for 20 years. Not one of them has turned out to be a terrorist.
The problem.
And that's the kind of thing a president needs to say to the people. And the president spoke as if he was talking only to Republican presidential candidates and not to people. It's not just the far right. It's a broad swath of America who looked at what happened in Paris and are frightened about this. And there are a lot of people beating the drums. He needs to calm them.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's very interesting also when you take a look at Michigan that we have the third highest number of Syrian refugees that have come here. So California, Texas, then us. And we've had this, and you said this in this conversation, that we've made this, we want immigrants here, we want people to come and work. By the governor coming out and saying, and no matter how nuanced his statements were, does that then turn people off from wanting to come here? If you're not even Syrian refugees, but immigration.
More importantly, it sends this message that stokes the fear as opposed to allaying it. I mean, we got to start facing some reality. Number one, it's true that no refugees have committed terrorist. There are more angry white males in America who've committed terrorist acts than refugees. So let's start there. The second thing that's true is that people got to start understanding what's going on in Syria and why it's happening. So much of our policy over the last 15 years in that region has fueled the instability in Syria, the civil war there, the factions that are coming in from Iraq are coming in because we dissolved the Iraqi army. That made it possible for these factions to sort of coalesce and start causing trouble. So we've got to start thinking about, instead of saying, oh my gosh, there's going to be a terrorist attack, which there should be security about, we should be concerned and try to prevent it. We also need to start talking about what's causing all of this trouble in the first place and how we might play a role in turning that around. And that's a really difficult conversation with people who are scared, but stoking those fears is irresponsible.
And I didn't see anything the governor did that stoked the fear. He was very careful to talk about the benefits of immigration, his desire for immigration. What he was trying to do is take a step back and be prudent and take the steps the president should have taken to tell the people this is going to be okay. Exactly as you said, these folks come here, they contribute, they've never been a problem. That's the message that he's trying to get out. I think Michigan would be a perfect place for a summit on of all the governors and the State Department, the Homeland Security, how we can make this work. All people want to know is that this program is going to be carefully executed.
All right, so just about 24 hours ago, Brooks Patterson came out, though, because they are building some housing in Pontiac, where they're ready to receive some Syrian refugees, and there are about 78 of them in Oakland County right now. The most, 66 of them, are in Troy. A lot of people think about Dearborn as the largest location for Syrian refugees, and that is not true right now. But what kind of disturbed me a little bit is Brooks wrote a letter to the mayor saying that you ought to halt this city project for Syrian refugees, and saying, can you give the residents, and I'm quoting him here, of Pontiac absolute assurance that the refugees they intend to house in their community would not contain one or two ISIS infiltrators? Of course you can't, and therein lies the risk. And that was a direct quote taken from one of the papers. That's disturbing to me.
Well, and that's exactly the sort of questioning claim that needs to be countered. This vetting process is an 18-month process, a 20-month process sometimes. I think if we just slow down and said we're going to take families first, we're going to take older refugees first, we're not going to cut off the flow, and then we're going to put young single refugees, male refugees in their 20s and 30s, sort of at the back of the line while we look at their social media, while we vet them a little more carefully. I think the American people would buy on. But you've got this misinformation here that, oh, they're not documented at all, they're not vetted at all. That's simply not true.
And look at the numbers. I mean, you're talking about less than 20% of the population of the refugees who fall into that category in the first place. Most of them are families, women, children, older people. Very few of them are young males, partially because so many of the young males in Syria are involved in fighting the war. They're not fleeing. They've been caught up in one of the factions that's involved in the civil war. And again, understanding what is going on in that region is one of the things that we have got to get people to be able to do, to be able to process all of this stuff.
One of the questions they're dealing with in Europe is trying to separate out the economic refugees, people who are using this as an opportunity to come and get a better economic life, jobs, to those who are truly at risk, fearful, in danger, displaced from their homes. I'm not sure that's such a big problem in this country, because the difference between here and Europe, I mean, we've been watching this, all we know of refugees is what we've been seeing on television from Europe, where they take boats across, where they can walk across. To get into this country, there's a whole lot of paperwork involved. Sure. There is an ocean separating
and it takes a year and a half to almost 2 years on average is what they're saying to do this. What bothers me about this entire conversation that is happening surrounding what happened in Paris is how inflammatory everything has gotten. Whether it's seeping into the presidential race, where people are talking about, well, we could let Syrian refugees in, but only Christian Syrian refugees, or you have a mayor in Roanoke who is talking about the internment of the Japanese from World War II, saying that we should do something similar than what we did then, which is one of the most shameful parts of American history. So to me, what is bothersome is watching the way this is being talked about. Nolan, are we concentrating on the right thing here?
Well, what's happening here is we're letting the fearmongers control the conversation. And I'll go back to my original point, that performance by the president on Tuesday was disastrous for this cause. He was petulant, he was condescending, he was angry. He needed to be reassuring, because people do look at Paris and do have some legitimate fears. I mean, it's natural that people are afraid, particularly when you have ISIS saying, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to plant terrorists among the refugees, trying to, stoke those flames of resentment and fear. We need our leaders. I think Governor Snyder did a good job of that, of saying, let's step back and take a careful, rational look at this, and here's how the process worked. I think if people understood how the process worked a little better, I think a lot of this would die down.
Can you truly explain to people how this process worked? And I think we're going to see now a showdown in Congress with the House, who's now saying that we should have different regulations about letting refugees in. Can you truly explain Stephen, to people what this process is without jeopardizing security in some way?
What do you mean by
the process of vetting refugees?
Well, I mean, I don't think you're jeopardizing security by telling people that, look, there's a process, and then that process ferrets out people who have histories or even indications of being terrorists, and again, you couch that in the information that exists about what's going on. There have never been terrorist refugees in this country. The refugees who are coming from Syria don't even fit the profile, for the most part, of people who commit acts of terrorism. I don't think you have to jeopardize security to make this clear. I think you have to stop playing to the fears that people have, the irrational fears that people have. And there are a lot of people doing it. I don't think the president's one of them, by the way. I think that the president was trying to push back against some of this nonsense that you hear from governors around the country. They're absolutely saying things that are not true to justify irrational policy. I think he had an obligation to meet that where it was.
Message. And it might not be a bad time to pause and make sure Homeland Security is doing its job. That hasn't been the most effective agency. So I think it's not unfair to say, okay,
it's been effective enough that no refugees have ever done anything
at this point. And I think it's not a bad time to say, look, let's hear from Homeland Security. Let's hear from State Department. Let's make sure you are doing your job. I think the message here should be constant reassurance of the American people, and also a little better education on how terrorism does come to this country. A lot better lot easier to recruit people on the internet and homegrown terrorists than to sneak them through in refugees. There's no vetting process on the internet-bred terrorism, and that's the greater threat. It's better to focus people
That's how
on the
ISIS
right
has
threat.
functioned,
Exactly.
frankly.
So it's better to focus people on the right threat than the wrong threat.
All right, well, we'll have to continue and watch this because in Washington, we know lawmakers want to push for increased screening, and the president has threatened to veto any kind of legislation there. So we'll have to keep watching that. The fallout continues tonight in the Flint water crisis. Residents have filed a lawsuit. The head of the city's public works department has resigned. Doctors' offices are being flooded with families concerned about lead poisoning, and elected officials and activists are placing some of the blame for the unsafe drinking water on EPA rules. And just in Washington this week, you had several people testifying in front of the EPA panel, and it was Representative Kildee who was there. Also, the doctor who sounded the alarm at the Hurley Medical Center was there, and then you also had families saying what their complaints were for the water. I feel, Stephen, that this has died down a little bit, but this is just the beginning of what is going to be a very long and expensive road for the state of Michigan.
Expensive is the right word. I mean, I think the liability or the potential liability here for both the city and the state and maybe federal officials is pretty high. And then you talk about the costs of the consequences of this. I mean, you've got all these children in Flint who've been exposed to lead in their drinking water. Who knows, how dramatic the effects will be, but everyone agrees that whatever they are, it's irreversible. So you're talking about kids who will need extra services in schools, extra health services and things. I mean, we're not close to being able to quantify the damage from this. Lots of people, I suspect, will also lose their jobs. There will probably be some change in protocols in the way that the EPA communicates with the Department of Environmental Quality here and how that department deals with local municipalities. Then there's the bigger question of infrastructure. Why do we still have lead pipes leading to people's houses? And that's not just in Flint, that's in lots of places around the state. This was sort of the tip of a very, very big, messy iceberg.
And so I guess, Nolan, a lot of people say, well, how much is it going to cost? I mean, in this class action lawsuit alone, it could cost the state and the city
we don't know.
millions
I mean,
of
you
dollars.
don't know what it's going to cost until the actual harm is identified and brought to the table, and you got to see if they win that. I'm with Steve. I think the greater cost is one we know, and that is replacing all these pipes throughout Michigan that are carrying or that have lead in them, and that could be tens of billions of dollars. Question becomes, where's that money? Where's the money come from? We couldn't raise money to fix roads, and now we've got a much bigger infrastructure problem ahead of us.
They're testifying for the EPA about changing the federal rules for lead in the water. Stephen, but some people say, maybe the EPA is also part of the problem here, or was part of the problem in the entire Flint debacle.
Well, it's clear that one of two things happened. It's either that the EPA rules were not clear enough about what you were supposed to do and not supposed to do if you were going to switch from Detroit water system to the Flint River, or DEQ misinterpreted those rules and didn't enforce it against Flint. And I'm not sure we know which of those two truths is the stronger at this point. There was clearly a breakdown in the process somewhere. It's just not, I don't know that it's EPA more than it's DEQ. But certainly it's true that everybody knew that if you were going to do this, you needed to add that chemical to the water that would stop the corrosion, and nobody did it. So.
All right, we'll keep watching that as well. And finally tonight, our very own Stephen Henderson, that guy sitting right over there, is partnering with Mary Grove College on a project that will help revitalize a Detroit neighborhood with the help of a Knight Foundation grant. Stephen's childhood home will be transformed into a writer's residence and literary center. The home at 7124 Tuxedo has been ransacked and gutted, adding to the blight in the neighborhood. But the house will be restored, and Mary Grove will hire an English professor who will live there teach at the college, and then run the literary center for the community. This is a really ambitious project, and both, like Nolan and I were both really proud
Yeah,
of
you were
you.
just reading, and I'm like, really? I'm going to do all
You're
of that?
going to do all of that?
Is that really going to happen?
Well, Nolan and I are really, really proud of you, and it was great to see this all kind of unfold.
And we're getting him a tool belt for Christmas.
I can't wait to see this.
Start working on the house.
So why don't you go ahead and just kind of explain to us a little bit about how you even had this idea to rehab?
Well, I mean, the house has sat there for 3 years empty and been stripped, and I've, over that time, gotten to know more about what happened to that neighborhood since I lived there, which is a really long time ago, and of course it's a place that has suffered the same kind of abandonment and disinvestment as most neighborhoods in Detroit have. I got to know the folks at St. Cecilia Church again, which is around the corner from the house, and saw the things that they were doing. And over time came to the idea that I should do something, that living here and contributing to the city the way that I do at the newspaper and through media is maybe not quite all I want to do. That what would happen if one person looked back to where they were from at one house on a single block in a single neighborhood and said, let's change the fortunes here and see what else might happen. And so I went to Marygrove because I knew of their commitment to Detroit neighborhoods, and their student population is made up of people from neighborhoods just like that, a lot of them. And I thought, they might want to help. They said they did. So we came up with this idea.
You know, one of the interesting things to me is for years you've heard sort of white people in the suburbs say, I drove by my old house, I grew up in Detroit, or my mother's old house in Detroit. Oh no, it's a shame what happened to it. Now you're hearing, you know, like yourself, African Americans saying the same things. People who haven't left Detroit but are going back to neighbors, and it just speaks to sort of the generational blight. This has been going on a long time.
Forever. It's my entire life, the span of that, the decline of that neighborhood, and many neighborhoods like it.
So do you believe that, how long, what's your timeline, I guess, in terms of fixing up that house and then finding someone to actually live there in that neighborhood?
Well, we still actually have to raise quite a bit of money. The money that Knight is going to give us will pay for the first 2 years of the salary of the professor, so we still need to raise more money to keep that professor longer, and we need to raise the money to fix the house. We're starting now to think about that. The Knight grant helps, of course. One person gets in, and then it's easier to go to other people and say, you should help us too. But we're hoping to have the professor in the house teaching at the college by the fall of 2017. Which gives us about a year or so to raise the money and do the work on the house.
Why don't you get that woman who comes in and does the TV show Rebuilding Detroit?
Nicole
Why doesn't
Curtis.
she come do
I
it?
don't know. I have not heard from her.
You should put in. That'd be a good project.
She could do it all, and we wouldn't have to raise the money.
So what is, I guess, the reaction to your story, Ben, from people? Have they said, like, that's inspired me to maybe take a look at my childhood home and do it, or has it been like, that's kind of crazy, there's no way you're going to be able to do this?
It's the range, I think, of all of those things. The most interesting to me has been other people from that neighborhood reaching out and saying, hey, you know, I grew up around the corner from there, or I grew up across the street, and I remember your dad, or I remember your mom living there, and people saying, well, what do you need, right? What do you need to make this happen? I mean, the willingness of people to pitch in with work or with money has been really overwhelming in the last week and a half.
It would be terrific if DPS were functional enough to make this a voc ed project. I mean, you've got hundreds and hundreds of construction jobs now coming into the city through the Arena project, other big projects, and we aren't training Detroit children
to be able
in
to do
the
that.
trades, and those are really good middle class jobs. And I mean, they're vocational centers like Randolph, sitting basically empty now. This would be a great project for
them to work on.
High school voc ed.
You know, one of the
ed team.
interesting things in that neighborhood is there used to be 3 public schools within, 10 blocks of that house to our 0. Now they're all closed, most of them torn down because of the depopulation.
They still playing basketball at St. Cecilia?
They do still play basketball at St. Cecilia. And I believe there's going to be a pretty big investment in that institution too, so that will help bolster the neighborhood as well.
That's great. Well, you know, we're coming up on Thanksgiving, and while I am both thankful for both of you here on MiWeek, I am. I always love to go see the parade. We've been downtown a couple times to see it, or I watch it on television, and both of you are going to be there this year. And Nolan, what are you doing this year in the parade?
I am driving Mother Goose.
Again, if someone said to me, you know someone who is driving a float in the parade, who is it? Your name would be on the bottom of the list.
There you go. I went to float driving school Saturday. You can see a video of it on detnews.com up today. It's not as easy as it looks.
No, it doesn't look easy. Those things are
There's no windshield.
unwieldy.
You're not looking out at, you're just driving off a video screen, and you've got a guy walking in front of the float, walking backwards saying, come this way, go that way. And
don't take out any of the clowns or anything that are doing the.
I don't worry about that. I don't want to run over that guy because I can't go without him.
That's right. Okay, and you are the honorary Grand Marshal.
Honorary Grand Marshal. So I just have to ride in a car. I don't get to drive it.
Do you have like a pageant wave or something you got for us?
I told the children, I told my kids, practice the wave, right?
Right.
At the crowd. So they might do it, they might not.
I love it. Well, happy Thanksgiving to both of you. We'll be looking for both of you in the parade next Thursday. And that is going to do it for MiWeek. Thanks so much for joining us. We're going to continue our conversation online right after the show. So go to MiWeek.org for an extra segment that you won't see on TV. We're also on Facebook and Twitter, and that's where Stephen is already. He's already picked up the phone, so make sure you connect with us there. I'm Christy McDonald. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Recently, Michigan's economy has begun to turn around. Michigan's gained over 250,000 new jobs. We've paid off $20 billion in long-term debt. And our population is increasing for the first time in a decade. But to make Michigan a top 10 state, there's still plenty of work to be done. Step up and help put Michigan on top. Learn what you can do at MichiganTurnaroundPlan.com.
Funding is also provided by Delta,